Come on, connect up, connect up, connect up. Okay, it's waiting to connect. All right. Okay, let's go YouTube. What is up, everybody? It's Dr. Vibe here, host and producer of the award-winning The Dr. Vibe Show. As always, I like to say you're blessed, highly favored, a magnet for miracles, and a solution for someone's problem. And also do note that I am the host of Epic Conversations, and the Dr. Vibe Show is the home of Epic Conversations. Also realize I'm a certified empowerment coach and president and CEO of Express Your Vibe Coaching and Communications. And we just get more new friends coming on the Dr. Vibe Show Epic Conversations. And this one's another great new friend, but even better, he's a Canuck. And for those who don't know what a Canuck is, that's what we Canadians call each other. And, you know, I'm based in Toronto, and it's few and far between I get another fellow Canadian on the Epic Conversations. But I am very excited, very happy to have this young gentleman on. Tad Hargrave dedicated himself to learning his ancestral language, Scottish Gaelic, and it's the first Scottish Gaelic person I'm going to have on the Dr. Vibe Conversation who openly admits it in almost over 1,500 conversations. So that makes it really special. In both Nova Scotia and Scotland, he can speak Gaelic pretty good now. Well, I hope so. He also has a blog called Healing Whiteness and Exploration of the European Indigenous Soul. He writes at Dear White Men on Facebook and co-starred in Canada's second Gaelic language film, The Fiddler's Reel. Interesting. He currently lives in Edmonton, Alberta, traditionally known in the local indigenous language of the Cree as Amiskwaciy. I tried. Beaver Hill. And the other one, I'm not even going to try and pronounce. So, Tad, what's the other one? And later?
It's Amiskwaciwaskihegan.
Thank you very much. You see, like I'm only good for 3 or 4 syllables. Anything longer than that, that's one of the reasons I lost my hair. I think too much and try too hard. So Tad took it away from me, and his ancestors came primarily from Scotland, with some of the Ukraine as well. He is drawn to conversations around politics, history, ancestry, healing, and how they all intersect. He is gracing some of his wonderful weekend time, and he has had a beautiful weekend to talk and share about his article, Dear White Men. So welcome to the Dr. Vibe Show, the home of Epic Conversations, for the first time, and hopefully not the last time, a fellow Canuck, Tad Hargrave. How are you, Tad?
I'm doing so well. It's really wonderful to be here.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. And like I said, really good. And he's going to share about this article, Dear White Men. And anytime I've had articles around Dear White Men, it's always been written by people, most of the time, who are not white. So this is a nice little switch in a positive way, Tad addressing. Stick around, you'll find what it's all about. It's really good. So Tad, can you share a little background about yourself with our audience? We had a short little piece there that's very interesting. Can you go back where you grew up, raised, etc.?
Yeah, so I was born and raised in Edmonton, Alberta. I've lived here most of my life, traveled around a bit, but mostly based here. Went to a Waldorf school, kindergarten through grade 6, an arts high school, and had a fairly, slightly alternative, but I would say fairly mainstream life growing up here in Edmonton. My mother was a dealer for a homeopathic medicine called Valeda. And and so most of my young life was here, but then in just moving into my 20s, I ended up living in Santa Cruz and working with a group called Youth for Environmental Sanity. And through that project, I ended up leading a lot of youth environmental social justice summer camps, started a project called Youth Jams, which continues to this day. And with the intention of gathering together leading young change makers from around the world. And being a white guy from Canada, I was pretty sheltered, I think, to the dynamics, especially in Edmonton, pretty sheltered to the dynamics of, race, class, gender, and how that shows up. And I learned a lot kicking and screaming over the years about the realities that other people lived with, and particularly around race, I think is where it hit me most. And we had so many people of color, and I would just hear about the experiences and indigenous people and hear about their experiences, and there was this feeling of like, there's a lot of white people go through it when they first start to wake up to this. It's like a denial. It's like, it can't be that bad. Surely you're exaggerating, or it used to be that bad, but it's not. It's still that bad. Oh, well, but they don't realize it's what they're doing. They realize it, and you start. So I started to really. It's just heartbreaking, I guess, to learn the state of the world and finally kind of get a thumbprint of where you're actually at. And so it was for me. But it was a very tough time because simultaneously I would hear people of color say, name things that for the first time I was really hearing in a particular way of white privilege, white supremacy, whiteness, and at the same time saying, well, own the fact that you're white. But they were always very angry when they said it. And the more I learned about whiteness and what a white culture might be or where it might have come from, the less enamored I was with it. And so the thought of rooting myself in whiteness felt very unappealing increasingly. And then there were indigenous people who would often introduce themselves in their own indigenous languages in these circles that we would sit in. And I was so full of admiration for it and envy in a way, and yet felt no draw to those cultures, which had me feel like the most colonized white person who ever lived, because I had so many friends who were going and doing ceremony with indigenous people, and I was being invited, and it was, I could have gone, and I just didn't feel the draw. And then I had a couple indigenous friends who said, well, Ted, you've got your own indigenous roots and indigenous language and music and story and drumming and dance and song, all of this. And that had never occurred to me, that my own Celtic, Gaelic, ancestry held some of that for me. And that began I suppose it's been, over a 15-year process of digging into my own ancestry and roots. And of course, as a white person, when one does this, you start to realize that that most of the life of your ancestors existed before they were white, before this term white even existed. And that whiteness is some sort of a cover, or it's an amnesia. It's not who we are. It's the thing that guarantees we never remember who we are. So it's been just an exploration of a lot of the different threads of that and how that appears and what that might ask of us as white people in these particular times and places. And, I should, I suppose, preface everything I'm saying with, when I write these Dear White Men letters, and everything I write is really in the context of, and offered extremely cagily, offered with a lot of trepidation, specifically towards other white men living in North America, knowing full well that the experience of a white man in Alabama will be different than my experience as a white man here, just as a person of color's experience would be different in those two places. And that my experience as a white North American man is different than a European white man and Eastern and Western European. It's very particular. So I'm sort of trying to speak to a dynamic that I see in North America, of the way that I see white men in particular engage, the patterns that I see engaging in conversations around race. And I'm aware that white women have some of the same patterns. And, I'm aware that some of these patterns exist in communities of color. And it's just, for me, I keep the conversation focused on what I see with white men in North America in this particular time, knowing in 5 years, everything I have to say may not have any particular relevance to anybody.
I'm already sensing we may need to do a part 2, because there's so much you just shared there. I not to say it in a bad way, feel bad that we even have to talk about the article, just because just what you shared right there, that's a whole conversation itself. So I'm gonna see if we can peel off some of the things you already shared with us. Sure. I'm blessed to have a worldwide audience. So 2 things. First of all, people may not know the term indigenous. Can you give an explanation on what that means?
Oh boy, whew, that's $1 million question.
Okay, well, you got some time.
Sure. Well, I mean, it's, I would say the term indigenous would be used in the same word way some people might understand Aboriginal, or in French, les autochtones, the people of the land, people who live and are from and belong to a particular place and have woven themselves into that particular place. So in my area, that would be the Cree and the Blackfoot. You know, where you are, I think there's a number of the Mohawk, I think, out there, and the Aborigines in Australia, the Maori in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and in Europe, those people are still there, but deeply under the sway of colonization, I think, for the most part. But up in Northern Europe, you've got the Sami people, who are straight up white-skinned indigenous people. So it's really referring to those people who still live on the lands that they've, usually still living on lands they traditionally come from, but also living in an indigenous way of life, a way of life that is centered around the land and the relationship to the land, and living with it. That's my understanding of it,
Okay.
anyways. And I
No,
imagine
that's
other
good.
people would have different ways.
That's good. No, that's fine. When you were growing up, how much exposure did you have to indigenous culture? And then what was the moment you started wanting to know more about indigenous culture?
Very little. I would say very little exposure to, well, here's what I'd say is like very little exposure to non-European indigeneity. So, Native Americans or that whole thing. I just, a little bit, but, probably what most white people grew up with, cowboys and Indians, this sort of thing, dances with wolves at the best. And the first moment I felt drawn to it, I didn't realize I was being drawn to something indigenous. Hearing, old Celtic stories, and that music, the drumming, the dance, the song, all of that, bagpipes. I've just always loved it. I've always been drawn to it. And it's been present in my family. My uncle was a piper. My grandfather's a hereditary chieftain, of a certain branch of his clan. And so, the kilt, all this, there was always a draw for me, but I didn't understand it as indigenous. I didn't understand it as really coming from a place or a particular time. So the first time that it really struck me, that draw to learn more, was when my indigenous friends said, "You've got your own indigenous roots." And some light, it really just switched on, and all of a sudden I was reading every book on Celtic, Druidic, Gaelic, everything I could get my hands on. And of course, like often when we start with some of the not as scholarly or more new agey or less grounded stuff, but I eventually found my way to stuff that I think a little more reliable. And here I am.
I find this fascinating because you're educating me on stuff that I'm interested in, but I have no knowledge. You are so far ahead of me, and it's not a race or anything, but especially for my audience, this is a great learning piece. So you're providing valued information to them. I guess there's so many different ways I could go. Let me go this way. What is the status where you are of indigenous people, and has it gotten better or worse since you started passionately looking into this area?
Oh, again, that's a difficult thing. I imagine it's probably different for different tribes around Canada. In terms of Edmonton, I feel like I'm still dipping my toe into that. And one of Canada's great racism certainly is the racism towards Indigenous people. indigenous people live put on reservations, and I think a lot of us have heard the stories, and the history's pretty terrible, and the history hasn't gone anywhere. It's still present. Of course, I live in Alberta, which is the home of the tar sands, and Fort Chipewyan, which is just north of here. That river that runs through their town is deeply polluted as a result of the tailings ponds from the tar sands. And of course they say no, the tailings ponds won't leak, but of course they do. And the people most affected are often indigenous people. And this is the one of the often unspoken truths of time is that the environmental issues tend to impact indigenous people and people of color the most. The environmental racism of you have a toxic waste incinerator, and quite rightly, the white communities don't want them anywhere near because they're so toxic and are going to pollute the air and the water. And why would you want that? And they have the money to refuse it. And often people of color, indigenous people, those communities don't. And so they get saddled with them, and also saddled with all the health impacts of all this. So we're certainly seeing that in Alberta. I mean, is it getting better? I don't know. I mean, there's definitely been a rise of a lot of pride in indigeneity. There's a lot of decolonizing work that's going on, and it's probably a dangerous thing to speak about the indigenous community as if it's one thing, as if there's one group and they all see it the same way. There will be some that the last thing they want to do is connect with their roots. They're just happy to get a job, make some money, live in the city. They don't have a particular interest, like a lot of white people don't have a particular interest in their own European roots. And there's some that are deeply traditional and exploring that. And there's the corporate ones that have sold out a long time ago and are happy to make some money, on the backs of their people. There's all of it. It's all there. I imagine some of them who might be deciding to benefit from the state of affairs and from oil companies think it's going really well, and other ones less so. It's hard to say. There's been a lot of progress, I think, certainly, but I would say that much of that progress has come from within the communities, not directly from the government. But there's still a lot for me to learn on this.
Well, thanks for giving some of that background, and it's very much appreciated. Let's get to the article you wrote for the Good Men Project. What prompted you to write this article at this time?
Well, so just for some context, that article is part of a series that I write called Dear White Men. And I've written, I don't know, there's probably 250 pages of them at this point. So that was just one of them on this theme of cultural appropriation. And I suppose the timing of it is there were a number of things in the Canadian press around appropriation that were coming out. And so it just had me thinking about it and just, okay, well, what do I want to say about this? Because it's just one of these areas, the poverty of modern white culture show up. Part of the challenge, I think, is that for white people, there are two directions that white people tend to move in, especially when conversations around race appear. One is a sort of self-glorification, which we're seeing in the white nationalist movement right now, the alt-right, as they style themselves, the KKK. There's a sense of like, white people are the best. I mean, look at the European genius. Look at how civilization, came from Rome, and of course, ignoring all the African history of this and from Egypt. But there is this sense of like, white people are, look at what we've done. And there's so much trouble with that whole approach, because it says that the Romans, and the Greeks might have understood themselves as white, when the term is so much more recent than that, and it's very easy to project it backwards when it's doesn't fit or doesn't work in that way. But so there can be a self inflation amongst white people of like, yes, be proud of the fact you're white, because look what white people have contributed to the world, corporations and computers and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And the other side it can go is this self-loathing, this deep self-hatred of when white people start to wake up to what white people have done, there can be a real sense of like nothing good could have come from where I came from, you know, and the challenges. I mean, the challenge I think in progressive circles, when we look at the self-glorification, it's easy to say, okay, well that is clearly terrible. But what's less easy to see is the harm that the self-hatred does. Because if you hate yourself and where you come from, you know, another lens I've got to bring in here is being white, and maybe this is true for everybody, but I can certainly say it feels true for myself as a white person. There's a tremendous amount of privilege just in being white, you know, all the things I can do and don't have to worry about that if I were a person of color, I would. So there's all these privileges, you know, and I'm not going to go into a rant about white privilege. There's plenty out there on the internet you can find if you want to know, but that's there. But the other wing on this bird is there's also a tremendous amount of poverty. White people have an intense, well, let me try to thread this needle a little better. There is a privilege that accrues to white people because they are white, and that accrues only because they're white. And of course, you can be white and poor, you can be white and oppressed, but it's, you know, as I can't remember who it was on Twitter, you know, pointed out, you can be white and oppressed. You're just not oppressed because you're white. You're not disadvantaged because of the color of your skin. So one wing of the bird is this privilege that appears, but the other wing is this poverty. So it's an economic, political, social privilege, and yet a deep spiritual and cultural poverty. You know, because the topsoil of whiteness is just so shallow, because it's so recent. It's so new in the world. It's not a culture in the way that we might understand culture of, you know, like having good bacteria in your gut, how life affirming that is, and why we eat the kombucha and the kefir and the you know, all these things, because it's good for us. It's a healthy culture in our gut that sustains life, and this is what culture is supposed to do. Is it's supposed to be a life-sustaining, life-affirming enterprise. And whiteness is not that. You know, it has hallmarks and certain behaviors and patterns, but it's a, I haven't really figured out what to call it, but I almost want to call it an anti-culture these days, because it's so against life. It's so against those things which really bring us health and well-being. There's no rootedness to it, and it's based on lies. It's based on, you know, a lot of myths, I think. And so there's this deep poverty. And that poverty, when you combine that with a self-hatred, you get a hunger for what all humans need, which is a sense of culture, a sense of connection to the earth, etc. And so I would submit, and I'm not, you know, the one who came up with this. This is an elder I've been studying with, pointed it out, said, you know, just pointed out that the inclination to grab things from other cultures comes from the self-hatred. You know, if we thought we came from somewhere beautiful, we'd be wearing kilts, you know, and we'd be real happy, and we'd swagger around and like, look how good I look in my traditional gear and regalia. You know, we wouldn't have feather headdresses. You know, those of us from the Ukraine would have these beautiful flower headdresses made out of flowers that are traditional there. There's so much beauty and depth in European culture that's just as indigenous people anywhere else. It's just the colonization happened longer ago, and so it's a little harder to reconstruct sometimes or find. And but so that's what I see. I see that there's a self-hatred, and it shows up in a hunger that, you know, to look at it in another way, when men behave inappropriately with women, it's often out of a deep hunger for something. And that might be for feminine energy, but it might be for masculine energy too. It might be a hunger for father, but we try to find it in women. And the hunger can blind us to what's really going on right in front of us, where we can't see the impact that we're having on women, or we can't see inappropriate behavior even when it's happening right in front of us, of another man to a woman. And the same thing, I think, happens culturally, where the way that white people engage with other cultures is so lacking in courtesy and respect, because it's very hard to see, because we're so starving for culture. We're so starving for something that's going to feed our souls. And so when it appears, it's like the old timers say, food makes hunger. You can go without eating for a while and not realize you're hungry, and then you smell the food. And if it's been a long time since you've eaten, you can be racked suddenly with a hunger that's very difficult. You can eat things that aren't yours to eat. So in my experience, when white people have been it's kind of sequestered into this sterile anti-culture life, and suddenly they're presented with some real authentic culture, there is a tendency to want to just consume it and wear it and eat it and use it, and to feed this hole inside themselves, and have no idea the consequences of what they're doing on those other cultures. So that's the long answer of why.
No, that's fantastic. We have a terminology on the Dr. Vibe Show, home of epic conversations. You're dropping knowledge bombs, Tad. You're dropping knowledge bombs. This is really good. And one of the close friends of the Dr. Vibe Show, Tachi, is saying, yes, we are expected to always behave with courtesy and respect towards a dominant culture. So she is fully in line, and that Tachi's hailing up from Florida. So thank you, Tachi, for enjoying the conversation and continue to provide good commentary. And we won't get enough time to go in depth on this article, because you're just as I said, dropping major knowledge bombs, and we're hoping and speaking that you're going to come back, because there's so much more we need to find out. But one of the things I found very interesting about your article is the approach you took: green light, yellow light, red light. Share with our audience where you got that from and using it in this context of your article.
I don't know. It sort of just came to me because I see there's so much confusion where, when we talk about cultural appropriation, the heart of this matter, for me at least, is that it's immensely complicated and fraught with pain. It's a minefield. And that complication is not served by saying either, well, no burritos for white people, and even eat burritos, nothing for them. Or the other side, which is oversimplified, which is the, well, it's a free-for-all then. This is the Burning Man thing, where people in Burning Man, because they want to express themselves creatively, just feel free to grab whatever they want. And in their minds, I'm speaking in overgeneralizations about Burning Man, but I've seen some message boards and I'm concerned. But there can be that sense of like, well, it's, cultures, it doesn't belong to anybody. And so it's so I don't think that serves the reality on the ground. So it's complicated. And that, but that can also stymie and freeze some white people from doing things that actually might help some of these communities. For example, in my experience, most indigenous people would be like, yeah, please buy our art. Please support our artists. Absolutely. Give us your money, So that's a green light. No problem there, going to a play that some indigenous theater troupe is putting on, wonderful. Anytime you are, investing, doing something that is going to directly invest in and support the community, God, there's no rules here. This is why I'm kind of measuring my words, but generally that's probably going to be a good thing. And there are certain things that are just a red light. There's certain epithets and words that we all know what they are, that white people should never ever use, And because those, like Ice Cube said to Bill Maher recently, just that pointing out how these words have been used as weapons against black people, and that, they've taken it back and you can't have it anymore. So there's certain words that's just, or, going in blackface, it's a no-go. Wearing traditional indigenous regalia like headdresses, it's a no-go. Attending an indigenous ceremony and then saying to your friends, hey, I'm going to lead one and charge idea what the hell you're doing, that's a red light. That's all red lights. So there are certain things where it's like, yes, please do it. As a white person, this is a beautiful way you can support these communities. And there's certain things that are absolute red lights. Just don't do it. It's just going to cause harm. There's no percentage at all. And that most of the consequences that will accrue from you doing it do not accrue to you as the white person. You know, the impact is felt in the communities you are ostensibly claiming to love and support. You know, like the whole madness with the Washington Redskins. You know, well, we're doing it because that's why I'm painting myself in red face and wearing this headdress is because I respect your culture. It's insanity, you know. But there's a lot of stuff that's a yellow light. It's a in the middle. It's hard to tell, you know. And in traffic, the yellow light is that thing that's telling you be careful. It's not saying speed up through the intersection, though I know some of us read it that way, but it's just telling you like something's changing right now. This is a liminal in between, we're not sure kind of thing. So proceed with caution. And the challenge is, I think part of it is that it's a endemic to the European, Indo-European language and mindset is this binary oppositional thinking, where things are either this or they're that. You know, it's black or it's white, it's good or it's bad, it's right or it's wrong, and there's nothing in between. And so when you take that to this conversation of cultural appropriation, people just want to be like, well, good or bad, thumbs up, thumbs down on all of it. And there are some things where, you know, in permaculture, it's a way of kind of an advanced way of working with land, I guess. And people will often ask permaculturists, it's like, well, what should I do with my house? And there's t-shirts they have where the words are, it depends. Because, it's like, well, where's the sun coming? And what's the water flow underground? And what do you want to grow? And what are your, et cetera. So there's so many things that you need to know before you make a decision. And people tend to, well, white people, in my experience, around cultural appropriation, tend to approach it. There's two different ways to approach this. I feel like one is through a lens of morality, where it's just, is it right or wrong? Give me the rule book. But so much of it is, what if the rule was, it depends? What if the rule was, this might be appropriate in some contexts and absolutely not in others? But the other way to look at it is through the lens of goodwill and asking ourselves, will my doing this foster more goodwill between peoples or damage it? And if we look at cultural appropriation through the lens of goodwill, I think we come to different conclusions. But I would just say part of the reason with the yellow light, when you're learning to drive, if you see a yellow light, it's probably wiser you treat it like a red light and just stop. Slow down, or slow down when you come to the intersection. It's you may, depending who's behind you, but you may just be a little safer than risking it. And so it is culturally. It's I think a lot of white people could do worse than treating yellow lights like red lights until they learn more, until they've got the cultural chops to understand what's appropriate when. There's a fellow who's a uncle of a friend of mine in town, Harold Cardinal, and he wrote a piece called "The Mystery of White Men," and it's on the Healing from Whiteness blog. But he was quoting somebody else, I can't remember who, but talking about the dynamic of like the difference between when a white person, when an indigenous person enters a new environment. And it was pointed out that when white people enter a new environment, I don't know if you've seen the supercut online of Donald Trump, sorry for even using his name, adjusting things. When he sits down at a table and he just starts moving things around, he has to adjust things at every table he sits at. Mm-hmm. That this is what white people do culturally, is we come into a new environment and there's a lot of activity all of a sudden. There's a lot of words, there's a lot of gesticulation, there's a lot of trying to control the environment in some way or, figure it out in a very active way. So whereas an indigenous person, when they enter an environment, they tend to become very still. And it can look like they're frozen with fear, but what's actually happening is that they're observing. And they're looking around, they're discerning what's appropriate here, what's good behavior, what's proper, by seeing what other people are doing, and very slowly, very gently, um, moving from that place. Whereas, for some reason, white people have this, in my experience around conversations around race and cultural appropriation, an incredible unearned swagger, a sense of there's nothing else for me to know about this. I know it all, and throwing weight around and kind of the bull in the china shop that leaves wreckage behind it and doesn't necessarily even realize that it's the one doing it, and yet there's the shattered china on the floor. So, and it's just interesting because how it occurred to me as I was writing, how many white people are like, well, I'm colorblind, I don't see color. But I would say these red, yellow, and green lights are also a color that most white people can't see. They can only see that there's a light that's on and then it's off. So, oh, well, if there's a light on, it must mean go. That must be what it means. It must mean, for so many white people, and I would just say also increasingly many of us in Western culture, there's a sense of if it's in the world, it must be in the world for me. If it's in the world, it must be okay that I just take it. Because why else would it be here? There's an incredible swelling entitlement that is endemic in white culture, because I think we've been on the receiving end of privilege for so long. And this Christmas I was out at my brother's place, and it was my niece's second Christmas, so really her first Christmas, because the first one she doesn't remember at all. But so many gifts, like just everyone went a little overboard on it. And she's opening them. She's pretty excited and said, well, that's from your Uncle Tad, and that's from your Grandma Jane, and that's from, But there was a certain point you could see her eyes kind of roll back in her head, glaze over, and it's just like she was drunk. Just, ripping it like, well, look at that, throws it down, the next one. And her father, seeing this, stops, It's like, okay, Thea, we're going to take a break. And immediately a volcanic, he's just screaming and crying, and, it's so terrible. Which is what happens to white people when somebody says stop. You have to stop taking now. This isn't for you. You've had enough now. So, yeah, I guess the light idea, the traffic light analogy, was just to try to give some general sense of guidance that there are some things that are okay. Probably most people recognize, and there's some things that are just not. From a place of goodwill, not morality, not right and wrong, not you're going to burn in hell. It's just from the consequences it's going to have to the relationship between white people in these cultures. It's just don't do it because the consequences are too high. And then there's all that in the middle. And the stuff in the middle, that yellow light stuff, is, I think, just requires so much. It's so deserving of all of our attention and patience, willingness to go extremely slowly, and observe the particular circumstance and dynamic until we understand it well enough to even discern what the appropriate thing might be, which is extremely hard to do when you're hungry. I mean, everyone knows you don't go grocery shopping when you're starving, because you make terrible decisions grocery shopping. And similarly, in terms of interacting with other cultures, for white people, there's a level of starvation that's there that until that is tended to, there's unfortunate and fairly predictable outcomes of how it's going to go.
Nice. Well, Tachi is loving what you're saying here. She says here the big problem with appropriation comes with commodification. I hope I got that right, with no attribution to the creators. When people say, quote, culture belongs to no one, unquote, it gives them permission to commodify these goods.
Yeah, well, I would say that one of the big red lights, or one of the big places, if it's not a red light, it's a burnt orange light, is when you as a white person are making money from something that's from another culture. I say burnt orange, maybe not red, because perhaps there are some situations where that could be appropriate. Maybe it's that you're making money, but all that money goes to that culture. But if you are straight up making a profit from something that's from another culture, and you are not um, recognizing that culture, and that culture is not, that community is not benefiting from it, and this isn't, just to be clear, this isn't just white people taking from, people of color and indigenous people. Um, there was in Cape Breton in Nova Scotia, there's a beautiful Gaelic language community out there. And there's a series of these kind of gas station books around like ghost stories of Cape Breton and all this. And a lot of these stories were gathered from the old traditional Gaelic speakers who had these stories, old time stories, from, some of them from Scotland, some of them changed, the characters changed to be from Nova Scotia, some created probably by that community. And those stories were gathered up. I think sometimes they were attributed, sometimes they weren't. But no money from the sales of those books actually went to the community where all the stories came from. And there's a deep bitterness about those books in those communities. Something was taken and nothing was ever given back. There was no reciprocal anything in those relationships. But the other thing too is that makes cultural appropriation tricky, and one of the big elements of these yellow lights are, let's say with dreadlocks. There's some black people who think it's totally okay. It's fine. It's like, as long as your vibe is good, as long as you're wearing them respectfully and conducting yourself well while you have the dreadlocks, it's fine. And there are other black people where it's like, absolutely not. So what you see in a number of examples is there is a division in indigenous communities or communities of color around what's appropriate. Exactly. Who do we share our ceremonies with? Is it okay that white people participate in them at all? Etc. And so that can sound like, to white people, it's like, aha, green light. If there's a divide, see, they can't even make up their mind, so I'll just take it. But I think what's being asked of us is to slow down into, it's like, okay, so you can see that you want to take this thing from this culture. It was from a particular place and time. You want to take it. Yeah, I want to take it. It's really cool. It's groovy. It's funky. It makes me look good, it's I want it. Okay, so you want it, and you don't imagine there's any discernible consequence to you taking it. Yeah, that's right. I mean, it's just, nobody owns it. I'll just take it. Who's getting hurt by me, having dreadlocks or going to the ceremony. Okay. That there's a disagreement. It's like, yeah, that's what I'm saying. They can't even make up their mind. So it must be, it's like, so what you're saying is if you take it, you are going to be instigating fights within that community. There will be conflicts inside of it when they fight with each other about what you've done. That's what you're saying right now. And that's often never been considered, or all the white people going down to do the ayahuasca ceremonies. And I'm not laying this down as a moral, white people should or should not do ayahuasca, but there are unintended consequences of the number of white people who are doing this now. The diminishment, I've heard stories anyways of the diminishment of the vine that makes the ayahuasca because it's being harvested so heavily. There's no consideration of what do you think it might do to the reputation of this shaman in this community that they're working with so many white people. There's a lot of consequence that we don't see and we don't want to see because it would get in the way of us getting what we want. And delayed gratification is not something humans are particularly good at, and I think white humans, in particular, and I should pause and just say, because I'm using this word white a lot, and I'm meaning it in a very particular way. I'm not saying white as skin tone, although it certainly has increasingly become that. But white, there was a time in the 1600s in the United States, people with my skin tone from Scotland were not considered white. The Irish were not considered white. The Jews were not considered white. White was upper class, Northwestern European, a lot of rich white British people. They were white. So white meant privilege, specifically, historically. It meant that you could own property, you could pass on things via inheritance, you could vote, etc. There's a whole list of these very distinct legal privileges, and those were not afforded to those who were not white. And that included the Irish, that included the Scottish, that included this. But there were a series of rebellions because everyone was being screwed by the man. Everyone who wasn't white was kind of getting the shaft. So, enslaved Africans, indentured Europeans, indigenous people were kind of like, yeah. And there was a series of rebellions, and the 10th of them almost burned down Jamestown. And the elite, I think, finally got it. They're like, we need to do something about this, but we can't kill them because they are the labor force, or they're defending the frontier, so we can't disarm them. What do we do? And the idea came, let's divide and conquer, and we'll do it based on the skin color. So gradually, everyone of European descent was embraced under the fold of being white and given those privileges. But it was basically like, look, if you're willing to stop organizing with all these people of color, you can vote, you can own property, you can have all these things, but your kids are going to go to English schools. You stop teaching them Gaelic, they're going to grow up to be white, basically. So they will lose their cultural patrimony, but they will be able to eat. And I imagine if I put myself in their shoes, of course I understand why they did it, but it did destroy any basis of unity for fighting together, because now they were more comfortable. And why resist anymore? Why not just go with the flow of the privileges? And so when I say white, I mean specifically those who have been on the receiving end of privilege ever since they became white. And when you've been on the receiving end of privilege that long, it does start to seem kind of normal. You do imagine that everyone else has the same privileges as you. And the second somebody stops the flow of that, there's going to be rage.
Well, because time has flown so quickly, I won't get too deeply into examples of the red light, yellow light, green light. What I will do, though, is ask you, well, just give the audience some examples of what Tad thinks is a green light. So a green light is learning indigenous crafting skills, or attending an art festival for non-white cultures. Again, you're giving them money. He then goes on to, and that's some of the examples he gives. I know, definitely go to the article. I put the link of it in the post, and it'll also be in the post replay. He regards a yellow light as an example of white people doing yoga. Let's be clear, yoga was brought to the West by people from India, yet it's so much more than the poses. I like that one. That's cute. And he talks also, he just talked about it recently, about dreadlocks on white people. There's no clear agreement here. Some black people don't mind. There's a history of dreads in most cultures, including Europe. I just saw one here that was saying, tourism to other cultures, yet it brings money to struggling communities, but tourism destroys these cultures too. There are many different approaches to doing tours. I want you to expand on that one.
Sure. Yeah. Well, it's very similar to gentrification and how this goes. I don't know the neighborhoods in Toronto well enough, but I lived in the Bay Area and, San Francisco. And so you've got like certain areas, the Mission and West Oakland, that have traditionally been communities of color that live there. So a lot of poor artists, communities of color, so very rich in culture, a very vibrant, beautiful place to be. And eventually white people sniff it out and it's like, oh, culture, that thing we don't have. And so then, rich people and white people start moving in. And on one level, you can look at it as like, well, hey, look, they're bringing their money into those communities. They're spending money probably in some of those local businesses and et cetera. But of course, the unintended but inevitable consequence of it is the landlords realize like, hey, all these rich Silicon Valley folks are moving in, so let's raise the rents because we can get more money from these people. And it's true. But then the rent becomes too expensive for the very people who made that community and that neighborhood so extravagantly, outrageously alive.
True.
And then the Starbucks comes in, and that, et cetera, et cetera. And pretty soon it's an echo of what it was. It's the shadow of what it used to be. And all those people have to move somewhere else, so they move further out into the East Bay. And so tourism has a similar impact where, I mean, let's be clear, when tourists go to other countries, there's a bandwidth of comfort they have of how much unfamiliar they can take. If as a white person you suddenly are at a Bedouin camp, there's not much you recognize. And you don't know the language suddenly, you don't know any of these customs and cultures, and women are covered up and men are behaving in ways that you don't, And a lot of it can be very disconcerting. So if you want people to visit your community as tourists, you suddenly have to start making these concessions like, well, yeah, let's put a Starbucks in because that's familiar. And let's make sure there are English speaker, English signs, and suddenly the culture starts changing so slowly at first, but to accommodate the Westerners and the tourists coming in. And so, well, let's sell burgers because that's familiar. They understand burgers. So now you've got food and cultural things coming in that are not from that culture, not from that community, and pretty soon it really stops resembling that place. I was reading a book called The Shepherd's Life by a fellow who's a shepherd in the Lake District of England, and he was touring in China, and there was this community, and it used to be a farming community, much like his own, where he lives, and we're still a farming community. And there was a Chinese woman, she was selling these little plastic knickknacks. And they talked, and he's like, what did you do before? He's like, oh, pigs and chickens and ducks we used to farm. He's like, what do you prefer? And she said, well, there's more kind of money in what I'm doing now and selling it. But she's like, and also the pigs and ducks, they make everything so messy, and tourists don't like mess. They don't like any poop on their shoes. Yep. They don't like. So the whole culture began to change until it was no longer the culture that people go and they get to feel like they're having an ethnic experience. Something a little exotic, but they have no idea that it's been changed so much to accommodate them. And so it's this elder I've been studying with points out when we as white people want to go to some, or maybe North Americans period, but when we want to go to some indigenous culture for some ceremony, or to learn from them, because we see, maybe rightly so, that there is a deeper level of sanity still in some of those cultures who haven't been put under the sway of capitalism in the market. That when we do that, certainly we do leave with some more sanity. That's got to be attested to. I know people who've done ayahuasca and come back and it's really changed their life and opened their mind, and they're in a much probably better place, healthier place for the world. But we also leave some of our crazy there. We leave some of our dysfunction and ill health there. It's not presence in these places. And none of that is to say don't do it. None of that is to put a morality into it. But it's to beg and plead for us to be willing to, when we are even thinking about entering a new environment, to stop and become very still and ask ourselves, what might the unintended consequences of this be on the goodwill between us as people?
It's interesting you mentioned about gentrification. I don't think there's too many cities in North America, and not too many cities in the world, major cities in the world, that isn't happening. One of those areas in Toronto is an area called Regent Park, and Regent Park has its challenges, etc. And gentrification has come there, and you see all these new buildings, all these new condos, and the homes. Obviously, the people that were asked to leave, they can't afford them. They cannot afford them. So it's certainly an ongoing challenge, and not really much is being said about it.
Mm. It's seems to be the way it is, and so so much of what I'm pleading with too, or pleading for in these Dear White Men letters and these conversations is a willingness to actually know the time and place that you're in. For white people anyways, to understand it. It's like there are patterns of what's happening, and those patterns are knowable if you want to know them. And no, that's not absolutes. But this is part of I think the kind of white or Indo-European mind is, if it's not absolute, it doesn't exist. And so I think our minds can lose so much of the fluidity that they need. Where it's like, no, it's not absolute, but there is a pattern. There's a tendency. There's a habit here. There's a certain twitch that our culture has. And, there's a reason that comedians of color in particular can make jokes about white people and get so much laughter. There's that hashtag white people, you know, because, or, the stuff white people like website, because it's not such a mystery. It's a mystery to us. Like when white people wake up to what? Oh, this is something white people do. It's like, of course we don't see it because we're inside of it. But, there's that one James Baldwin line that just strikes me as so powerful. It was in the I'm Not Your Negro movie. I don't know if you've seen it, but incredible documentary about about James Baldwin. And one of the lines he said was something to the effect of, in speaking to white people, he was saying, "You placed yourself at a terrible disadvantage because for so long you've dedicated yourselves to ignoring us, and all the while we've been looking at you, and we know you better than you know you." So much of the critique and analysis around whiteness and white culture did not come from white people. So there's an enormous debt. There's an enormous amount of gratitude, I think, that is owed to people of color who've been willing to speak about the things they see. There's an old Irish proverb that translates as basically a friend's eye is a good looking glass. It's a good mirror. And I feel like people of color, white people, but it's not something that white people, of course, always want to hear. We don't always want to have reflected back to us the ways, and the patterns that we have that may not be as beautiful as we'd like. And but so this analysis has come from people of color pointing out what they see, the patterns from the outside, and so it is discernible, it is knowable, and it's perhaps one of the greatest hallmarks of white culture is that white people either refuse to or are temporarily rendered incapable of understanding themselves as a group. Most do we have time for one more little
Absolutely.
riff? Okay. So one of the pieces I wrote years ago was about the 3 levels of whiteness, and I was at a diversity workshop maybe 20 years ago now, and they talked about there were 3 levels of identity: individual, collective, and universal. So the individual, everyone's a precious snowflake. Universal, we're all one, and collective, just that we're a part of groups. And what struck me, I remember I was at an event. It was mostly white people in a circle, and there's one black fellow. And at one point, in a moment of frustration, he was like, "Y'all need to deal with your racist shit." And of course, this triggered so much in the white people. And there was an enormous amount of activity now and response. And I noticed there were certain things that kept being said. And then over the years, in conversations around race, I kept hearing the same things. And I finally realized everything almost entirely that white people would say in response to this would fall into one of 2 camps, either the individual or the universal. So the individual response would sound like, "But I didn't own slaves. I wasn't there. Why are you mad at me? Why are you, I need to deal with my racist shit, but I'm not racist. Why are you doing this to me? It's not me. You're misdirecting your anger." The universal response would sound something like, "Oh my God, but we're all one. Why are you making this about race? Why are you dividing us? No, we're all one, brah, one love." Sounds like that. And the reason that happens is because when this, a black fellow was sharing his frustration of, "Y'all need to deal with your racist shit," I don't know for sure, but I imagine he wasn't just speaking to the people in the room. He was hoping, I think, to speak through them to the other people, to their friends. He was speaking, at least in part, to white people as a group, and maybe even primarily so. When he said y'all, it wasn't you all in this room. It was you all white people, but white people have a very difficult time understanding themselves as a group, as a culture, as anything. And so when a critique comes of white people, the only way we can hear it, because we lack that collective sense, is we can only hear it through the ears of individual or universal. So it either sounds like you're mad at me, or you poor thing, you're so confused, you don't see the spiritual reality of this, let me teach you. And So it's so much of my work is attempting to drop some dye in the water, so that white people can see that there is a pattern of swirling that's going on, and to start to try to name some of these things. And and of course, I'm not the first to do it uh, by any stretch. Um, Again, most of this has come from people of color who've articulated this. Certainly Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, and Bell Hooks, and Audre Lorde, and James Baldwin, et cetera, et cetera. Name some things. And I think white people, it's not the only lens. I think it's important that white people don't only see ourselves through this lens, but we've got to be willing to. Because if, James, I'm quoting James Baldwin a lot today, but one of his other lines I love is not everything that is faced can be changed, but everything must be faced to be changed. So, yeah, I suppose that's a bit of what I'm on about, and I'm flattered that you would think I had anything useful or relevant to say on this at all.
No, you've been fantastic. We won't get into some of the red lights because Tad has already mentioned some of them in our conversation. He referred to blackface, and also the Washington Redskins and Native mascots have to go, and white people using the N word or other racial epithets. So definitely, if you want to dig more into the article, it's certainly available at the Good Men Project. Tad, what sort of response have you had to this article?
Sorry, I just had it on mute. The response has been pretty good overall. And I would just say overall, the response I tend to get from people of color, indigenous people, has been supportive or, thumbs up. And from white people, it's been a lot more mixed. And the biggest challenge, of course, is from white men who are understandably defensive about being spoken of or named as a group in this way. So I don't know. Perhaps I'll get more skillful at it over the years and find more eloquent ways in. But yeah. So overall, I mean, for that article, but it's interesting because it's just I would just say the thing I would flag is what I gave is a very rough sense of things from my vantage point. And there are people who would disagree with a lot of things on that list. There are people who take some of those yellows and put them in red, or take some of the reds and put them in yellow, or et cetera. So there's no, there really isn't a rule book about this. I give that as it's like training wheels. But what's actually asked of us is learning how to ride a bike, and what's actually asked of us is to pay attention in the moment. And there's this community in Tamara. It's like a kind of free love community. It's very beautiful. I mean, that's a terrible characterization, but they do a lot of kind of research around relationships and love. And one of the lines they have is they say, you can do anything you want as long as you know what you do. And in my experience, most white people around these issues have no idea what they're doing.
That is a powerful statement to end off our epic conversation, Tad. I'd like to say thank you so much for just laying it down, dropping some knowledge bombs in regards to this, and really an educational piece in a lot of ways. And it's something that needs to be, you're an agent of change, and it's a conversation that needs to be brought out wider. Let me ask before we let you go a few quick things. In the current social political environment that we're in North America, where do you see this subject going? Forwards, backwards, hopefully going ahead? And if it needs to go ahead further, what do you feel needs to be done?
Around cultural appropriation or
Yes.
racism, cultural appropriation. I think we are seeing it changing for the better, is what it seems. I mean, at least in certain circles, I mean, there's certain things, it's like, people don't do blackface anymore without blowback. unless they're in a just amongst themselves at some, party of other white people who are racist. Um, look at the blowback Bill Maher got, and God, I hope he gets more on it because I don't know how seriously he's taken. But there's certain words, it's just like there is an immense response to these things, and so I think we are seeing it changing. But frankly, on the other side of it, I think what we're seeing is, in terms of white people, an increasing polarization into either self-glorification or self-hatred. And neither of those actually bode particularly well for this topic of cultural appropriation.
And sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, because also to be clear, self-glorification, these white supremacists, they appropriate their own cultures. They will take signs and emblems and insignia and words and myths and stories from their own indigenous culture and use it to justify their vile white supremacy. And the self-loathing eventually will turn into either just collapsed allies who maybe know the textbook something but can't afford to understand the deeper sense of things, or white going to keep grabbing, and there's just such a hunger, and I don't know if I see that hunger being tended to properly these days. I see a lot of trying to cover the hole, or trying to fill it with something that's never going to fill it. This culture doesn't seem to be, in my experience, getting more sane. That doesn't seem to be the trajectory of it. So I imagine that will, the tragedy, and may it be different, but I imagine as you get indigenous cultures kind of rising up and you have this hunger, the presence of food will probably create more hunger and more. So I don't see this conversation going anywhere for quite a while, until white people learn to feed that cultural void with something that is not other people's cultures.
For those cultures that that are being misappropriated, what calls to action do you have for them?
I've got no advice at all for them. Yeah, I don't know. It would be just extremely improper for me to suggest any course of action for a community where I have no lived experience.
Okay.
The only thing I could say is the only call I've got is for white people, and in particular white men.
Right.
Just that's the experience I understand. And my call would be just slow down your roll.
Makes perfect sense.
Courtesy above everything else. Okay. Pay attention. It might just be that our willingness as white people to slow down and not take the thing that we think that we need to empower and transform ourselves, the not doing it might just be the transformative thing that we're looking for.
Excellent. Well, on that note, Tad, thank you for taking time out of the Positive Productive schedule your Positive Productive schedule to share with us, and much appreciated. And as I said to you before we went on live, the mic is always open for you to come back. If people want to find out more about what you're doing, how can they do that?
Well, in regards to all of this, I've got a website called healingfromwhiteness.blogspot.ca. And if you go to facebook.com/dearwhitemen, you'll find my page. And that's where I'm slowly publishing a lot of these letters. But also people can just follow me on Facebook, Tad Hargrave, Hargrave, and I post a lot of things around these topics there. But those two, the most concise, guaranteed shot of those is going to be the Dear White Men Facebook page and the Healing from Whiteness blog.
Excellent. Well, we will put that in. That information is up on the post promoting this epic conversation, but on the post for the replay, we'll also include it also. My name is Dr. Vibe. I'm host and producer of the award-winning Dr. Vibe show, which is the home of Epic Conversations, and I'm the host of Epic Conversations. If you want to touch base with me, the three best ways are Twitter at drvibeshow, email address dr.vibe at the drvibeshow.com, and also you can go to the website address www.the drvibeshow.com. Also know I'm a certified empowerment coach, and if you want a complimentary empowerment session, please get in touch with me, because I believe the more empowerment you have in your own life, the better your life will be, and also the better your life will be for others. If you want to see any of the replays of some of my epic conversations, certainly go to the YouTube page. We have a whole pile of epic conversations there, so please check them out. If you want to listen to them via audio, just go to the website or other platforms such as the Good Men Project, which Tad had his article shared on. I've been a contributor of content on that site for almost 4 years now. There's also WJMSradio.com. There's Apple Podcasts. There's iHeartRadio. There's Tuned In Radio. There's Stitcher Radio and other ones. But just go on the website and you'll be able to check it out. Upcoming conversation tomorrow night, 8 p.m. Eastern Time. We have a lady named Karen Fleshman, and she is going to be discussing. She's actually a race equity trainer, HuffPost blogger, and government accountability activist. She's going to be talking about white supremacy. So we're going to be continuing the conversation on this. And please feel free, if you want to contact me and have any specific subject as a conversation, 99% of the time, it's a go. So as I like to say, you're blessed and highly favored. You're a magnet for miracles, and you're a solution for someone's problem. Remember, God bless, peace be well, keep the faith. Thanks for watching, especially Tachi. Thank you for being in the audience right from the get-go. It's appreciated and not taken for granted. We will want Tad back when he is ready to come back. And remember, sometimes you have to get smaller to get stronger. God bless, be well, and have a great evening. Thanks again for watching another epic conversation live or on the replay. Good night.